All right, everyone. Well, welcome. I'd like to introduce you to Chad Carlson. He is a technical writer for the developer relations team at Platform.sh, a polyglot platform as a service provider and DevOps platform. In the recent months, Chad has spent time exploring headless CMSs, specifically as the pattern relates to Gatsby's source plugin ecosystem. He's worked on projects for pulling content from Strapi and WordPress into Gatsby and deploying to Platform.sh. And today we'll cover some more recent experiments doing the same thing with Drupal as a content backend. Chad's a Drupal newbie, and his integration has been his first long-term Drupal project. Outside of PHP, Chad is usually writing or trying to teach himself Go. So Chad, I'm going to hand off to you, and if you have any questions during the session, definitely post them in the chat here, and looking forward to it.
Sure thing. Thank you, Brian. Hi, everyone. As Brian said, my name is Chad Carlson. I'm a technical writer at Platform.sh, and thank you for joining for this talk. I'm not sure how much any of you are familiar with Gatsby specifically, or trying to implement this headless CMS idea that everybody seems so excited about, but I was hoping to show you some of the work that I've been doing at Platform and how we were able to start experimenting with this headless CMS within the multi-application virtual cluster sort of configuration that we have at Platform. And so this would be one implementation of that, in this case, using a Gatsby site as our front-end site, and then pulling in content from an installation of Drupal so that you could very well create a project for a client where content creators are restricted to adding and editing content on the Drupal backend, and everything is set up for them on the front end. They don't really need to touch that. I was told to turn off my camera because that'll make it so I have my slides full screen during the recording. So let's do that. Here is a picture of me. I am a technical writer for the DevRel team at Platform.sh. What that means is most of the time when I'm working, I am working on our public documentation or maintaining the site itself of our public docs, and then also writing and maintaining our template projects, which I think we have about 70 at this point running on Platform. And this headless CMS idea has been the most recent assignment I've gotten, in which I've taken Gatsby and use that as a front end for different CMS backends. In this case, it has been Strapi, which is an API, a framework where you can very easily create your CMS API. Also the same for WordPress, utilizing the API that it serves, and in the case of this talk, Drupal as the backend. So my hope for the talk today is to give a little introduction to Gatsby for anybody who may not be familiar with it or how it works, and transition into how it implements this headless CMS idea, pulling content from Drupal or WordPress using the source plugin ecosystem. I can double click on this slides itself. What does this say? On the side panel. And then we'll transition again into how we can, okay, thanks, Michael. So then I'm going to transition into how we can configure a multi-application container project on Platform.sh so we can actually get this running so that content is being pulled from Drupal into Gatsby, how we can put them together. And then a additional feature is this live preview feature that we can set up on development environments. In Gatsby, they're setting this up as a separate service so that you have a Drupal installation that is pointing at a specific Gatsby installation that Gatsby serves for their own platforms or their own software as a service offering for Gatsby installations. And you can actually edit your content in Drupal, ping for a live preview, and get a live generated preview on that Gatsby site. And we can replicate a lot of that here on Platform.sh in a single project. So to start off with Gatsby, it is a static site generator For Node.js, we'll see that in this particular implementation, they will often say, we're not just a static site generator, and they are really proud of their ability to pull in various services into its build process. It is React-based. It provides a lot of templating tools for setting up individual pages, categories of pages, with smart imports for whatever your assets may be on a particular page, so that they're only installed in that final build on the pages that really need them, resulting in potentially a little bit longer of a build, but a really fast experience for client side. Individual pages can be defined within this sort of structure here, where everything sits within source, and you define individual kind of list pages that you might see in something like Hugo within this pages subdirectory for articles.js, giving you the template for setting that up, which is kind of going to be the focus of setting this up with Drupal in this talk, as well as individual templates for an individual article page, so the singular of that article.js. Outside of the content template files, the two most important scripts to keep in mind for setting this up are going to be this Gatsby-node.js, which is going to place our GraphQL queries on Drupal and set up individual article pages or our article list page during our Gatsby build based off of what GraphQL retrieves and puts into the data layer of Gatsby. And then the second one is our Gatsby config.js file, which obviously is going to be our main configuration that's containing site metadata, but it's also where we're going to define these source plugins. In this case, going to be Gatsby Drupal. Wow, there's some really intense lightning going on outside right now. So what does this ecosystem look like in the context of headless CMSs? So for Drupal, we can define a plugin in this Gatsby config.js file for Gatsby source Drupal. There's a module exports block with a plugins attribute that you can resolve to the individual Gatsby source Drupal source plugin. And then you can define within its options the base URL that you want Gatsby to pull its content from. In this case, it's going to pull it from that default JSON API endpoint that is set up by Drupal. You can do this for, like I said, WordPress Strappy for content, for this kind of article-based content, but it is set up during its build to do very similar things if you wanted to integrate additional services, like Stripe for credit card processing or anything for authentication. You can pull it in this very same pattern. So in the case that we're talking about here, during Gatsby's build, it's going to place a query into or onto that Drupal backend site, which in this case is going to be a separate application container on the same project on Platform.sh. And it's going to get that big object of all the content. It's going to use that Gatsby-node.js file to generate the individual pages. And it's going to extend our build a little bit, but then you're going to have a fully built site that isn't going to depend on continuing to request your Drupal site, to place requests on your Drupal site to get that content when a client visits the page. It's all going to be done during build. This is a graphic from Gatsby's documentation with that broader context that we're talking here, trying to move away from this full stack CMS architecture to a more modular one where Gatsby uses its builds to potentially pull in content from not just Drupal, but multiple CMSs during its build, as well as Algolia for search, Stripe for payment processing, all during your builds to build that site. So on Platform.sh, what you can do is ultimately we want a single installation of Drupal and we want one of Gatsby. They need to be able to communicate with each other. And the way that it's currently offered is that you have that separate Gatsby installation offered by Gatsby somewhere, and then you host your Drupal site where you have it already, that your content editors have access to it. And on Platform, you can define this configuration of multiple application containers in that single project. All you need is a file that describes how requests are directed to a backend and a front-end application in this root YAML file. You have another one that defines your services that are shared between all the application containers, which in this case for our install of Drupal is going to be MariaDB and Redis that isn't used by Gatsby actually. And then we're going to have two application definition files, this .platform app YAML file, where we only need to define its runtime, how we want it to build and deploy, start, and the disk that we want to give it. And it's going to have this structure that you're going to see at the bottom of the slide right here. Two subdirectories, one for the Drupal site, one for the Gatsby site, and app YAML for each. Each of these app YAML files are going to have a block called relationships that in the case of Drupal, once we've defined the runtime and the name of the application container, is going to find relationships to our services, our database, and our cache. But in Gatsby, we're actually going to use this relationship to open up a place where we can request that content that's being served up by Drupal into this separate application container. And then what we're going to do, based off the way that Platform runs its build and deploy pipeline, we're going to wait until Drupal is fully deployed. And in our final last step, once requests are possible during this post-deploy hook, we're going to build our Gatsby site a little later than we might normally. And that'll allow us to actually pull that content from the Drupal application container. This is what that order looks like on Platform. Typically, we would probably build the Gatsby site during the build hook. It would be hooks.build in that YAML file, but we can delay it past when requests start to be served in our Drupal site, and so that we can actually have access to all that content in the back end. So right here, we have a snippet of that gatsby-config.js file that I was talking about. It sits within that subdirectory specific to Gatsby, and it is going to define, here's a helper library that we have for retrieving environment variables, which in this case, like I said during our post-deploy hook, it's going to find that backend root for our Drupal application. And we're going to use that definition to define this Gatsby source Drupal source plugin, so that during our build, it's going to say, I want to use this plugin. It's going to be the Drupal plugin. Here is the base URL. And it's going to use that to then generate, with the help of our Node.js file, individual pages for each article that happens to be on that Drupal site. And the way that we can assist Gatsby in doing that is loading a few modules into our Drupal installation. In this case, we're going to use path auto so that we can substitute our hashed node location for an individual article and substitute it for an article's slug of the title that we give that Drupal article, so that Drupal is serving in each individual article at article / whatever the title is. And that's the pattern that Gatsby expects during its build. Now that it has the URL of the backend and it has this pattern, then we can start pulling in that data. And the way that we do that is we fill out this node.js file. And in this case, what we're doing is we're exploiting that JSON API endpoint on Drupal and placing this GraphQL query to find every article specified at that endpoint, including the title, its ID, and all of its body text, the path alias that we've defined for it, and then its image, the URL of that image, and the alt title of that image. And it is going to use the data found in that query to generate, using the template we've defined in our article.js file, to generate individual article pages, one for each article on our Drupal site. So I have a quick screen capture of our front-end Gatsby site. So what I have done is I've set up the configuration here a simple Drupal installation that's going to pass through all of our traffic through index.php with the implementation of Path Auto is going to then serve all of our content from that JSON API endpoint. Gatsby is going to delay its build until this post deploy hook, and then it's going to use our config.js file to read from environment variables what the backend URL is for our Drupal application container. And then it is going to pull that content, and it's going to use this Gatsby-Node.js file to then build the individual pages. And so what I have initialized for the Drupal backend site is 2 articles, title, some body content, and an image. And so this is going to be the result of that. We have a typo here. This is actually a backend Drupal 8 site. But it's going to give us an index page and then a list of articles, one for each of the articles on the backend. So our first and second article. And so that's great. I mean, that's all by itself, that's nice. We can separate the responsibilities between maintaining the front end application in Gatsby and its builds, how it makes these individual pages, any other services that we want to integrate from the content creation side of the Drupal backend. And we can do it all on one project in case anybody needs to fiddle with either of those. I guess I can take a moment to say, if there are anybody here who isn't familiar with the basics of Platform.sh, is not only do you define, say, your separate GitHub repository as including this structure right here, say that this is on your master environment, and it's going to deploy the final Gatsby site pulling from Drupal like I just showed on your master environment. What it also enables you to do is every time that you place a pull request on, say, the Gatsby front end, it's going to generate a live development environment for that configuration. And it's going to continue to leverage the fact that you're pulling this backend URL that has been generalized from our environment variables so that it continues to pull content not from your master environment, but from the development backend, so that you can adjust content on a development environment in your Drupal site and see that built on the front end, but it's restricted to this own isolated environment of Gatsby and Drupal as opposed to your production site. So that is nice, obviously, because you can go through this delivery model where you are continuously developing on that front end site, making changes to the way that you want it to be presented, and it's not affecting production. Obviously, you want to split that up. But what it also enables, in our case, is an interesting feature that Gatsby is steering into for their offering, which, like I said, would be you could very well host just a single Drupal application on platform.sh and use that as your backend that is serving content and is the served URL for that Drupal site is then placed into their offering of hosting your Gatsby site. So it is pulling content from Drupal that is on somewhere completely different, a totally different server. What they are also trying to enable is taking the final URL of the served Gatsby site and essentially differentiating between a production build and a development build so that you can get live content edit previews for that Gatsby site every time that you make a change on your backend Drupal site. So the way that this works is if you run Gatsby build for your Gatsby site, it's going to be a full build generating just the final HTML. If you run Gatsby develop, on the other hand, with this enable Gatsby refresh endpoint set to true as an environment variable, it's going to expose an additional endpoint of _ refresh for that Gatsby site, which, like I said, in their case, is on a completely different server somewhere. And then you can take the URL of this served Gatsby site and combine it with this Gatsby Live Preview and incremental builds module for Drupal. So then what that enables you to do is to edit your content, have this module installed and configured for the location of the Gatsby site, so that every time that you make a edit to that piece of content, it's going to give you a live preview on this development version of your Gatsby site elsewhere by hitting this refresh endpoint. It'll hit the endpoint, and then Gatsby will know, all right, look back at the Drupal site and see what content has changed. And it'll rebuild that site in this development state. And this is pretty cool, but the way that Platform.sh works is we could very easily set up a multi-application project and get away with the need of having them be on 2 separate servers. And so we've already done that for pulling content from the backend, but you can also set up the exact same thing in the way that we used config.js to pull the URL of our Drupal site. We can create a new relationship on our Drupal application to know where the Gatsby site is going to be so that it can ping this refresh endpoint. And so the way that we can differentiate between these two build states, in this case, we're doing it in both our post-deploy hook and our start command. So if we're on master, run the full build. That's this first part of the script here. This isn't one file, I've separated it. And then in our start command, if we are a master, we're just sleeping. We're serving all content to this root index.html in our public directory as a result of the build. But if it isn't master, I want to run the development version of the site, and I'm going to set this variable to true. So that now we have full builds on production on our master environment, but then anytime we open a development environment on platform, we're going to have this live preview feature available to us because we're in a development version of the site. We're going to have this refresh endpoint, and all we need to do is install this instant preview and incremental builds module along with some extras that it depends on for supporting its backend API. I think actually these are some of the modules that you need to enable to set up that API in the first place. But these two right here will set up this instant preview functionality for you. And then when you edit that module, what we're going to do is set it up for the front end sites. I'm going to ask you to ignore the fact that it says backend dot. This should actually just be PR5 forward. So it is going to know that this is where our Gatsby front end server is. And it's going to know that every time that we make an edit to our content, we can ping this _ refresh endpoint to cause an incremental build for all of the content that we want to send to it. And so I have a preview of it here. I have side by side a development environment on platform, where here is our Gatsby front end site. Looks the same as I showed you in the last one. And I have our backend Drupal site. And so I can take the body text. It's a little bit of an older screenshot that I showed to a Drupal cafe. But as soon as I save it, after a moment, it should update that. There we go. It'll update the content on that front end development application. And the same can go for, I think I also show an example of how you can change the image as well. Give it a new alt text, and it will update that on the front end site. I think maybe I did a refresh here on the front end. And there we go. And it'll update that on our preview server. So I imagine you can see a scenario where you're going to set up for somebody this multi-app project for a client. And really the workflow that they want to get into is having the ability to have some preview server for a new piece of content. Obviously, they can do that with a full build on platform without any of this live preview stuff. But it's this extra feature where change a single character, you don't necessarily want to go through the whole build of the project just for that one thing. And so this can give you the ability to make tweaks to content and give a live preview server on the front end. So I want to be honest quickly about where we are with this. You can deploy this multi-application container or this multi-application container project on platform, and you can open up a development environment and configure this live preview feature just as I've shown you and set it up just as I have in the demo here. In the introduction, I wanted to include that I'm kind of a Drupal newbie. We have people who are far more experienced in Drupal on our team who've been doing it for much longer, and I come from the Python space. So this has been an interesting project playing around with Drupal. The place that I'm at with this is it is set up to create content from this backend, and you can manually, every time you open a development environment, tell Drupal what that front-end Gatsby application is to create these live previews. But I haven't quite been able to figure out how to override the default configuration of this Gatsby incremental build module in order to set up really what the scenario we want is, which would be every time a development environment is opened, automatically configure it for the specific front end of the Gatsby site for that dedicated environment. I've had some success where I've seen it within, seen the overrides within Drush, but I don't know if I'm familiar enough with Gatsby's module system in order to do that straight away on each development environment. So this is what I'm working on now. I've gotten pretty much to the very end point, but pretty cool nonetheless as a project to play around with. Thank you all so much for joining me for this talk. I am, again, technical writer at Platform.sh. You can find my email and GitHub where I'm running these experiments. I am Twitterless, but you are more than welcome to reach out to me for any questions about this project or what we do at Platform. And I'd be happy to take any questions if anybody has them.
I didn't see any questions directly in the chat here, but does anybody have any questions that you'd like to post? All right, well, we'll go ahead and let me share my screen here.
Thank you all. I know that, oh, maybe it's this one. Got a blog site set up to pull content from a Drupal site. The content type is Paris. I'm having no problem in the content, though, is getting content. It's not something that I've played around with a lot, Jim. I'm sorry that I don't have an answer for that one. Mark, I'm working on the template right now. I think that my plan is prior to DrupalCon, which I will start doing a demo similar to this on Tuesday, I think Tuesday and Thursday, is to at least have a template ready in our templates organization on Platform, which is Platform.sh-templates, that will be as far as I'm showing right here. So it will set up the app containers. It will get you to the production build and to live preview being set up for you to, like I said, configure manually for that specific development environment, which when you merge won't affect your production environment, but it will require that first step of explicitly specifying the front-end URL for that dev environment. But my plan is to have that up before DrupalCon, so sometime before end of day Monday.
Brittany had a question here. I'm not familiar with Platform.sh. Can we try it out for a trial period or free without going live with something on Platform?
Well, we do have a free trial of 30 days. If you go to platform.sh, and I believe it's in the top right-hand corner for a free trial, it'll give you 30 days with a single project, in which case there's no requirement for you to deploy anything specific. We have, like I said, 70 templates that are directly accessible from the console there. So you, like I said, by Monday, you should be able to deploy this project if you're curious about it. But many other variations of Drupal, Drupal multi-site, Drupal 9, Drupal 8, Drupal 7, a version of Apinio, and I think one or two others. Oh, there's a Modic installation as well, Drupal with Modic. So yeah, that'll give you 30 days with it. Oh yeah, Mark, I saw that comment earlier. Wait, I have a question. When will this? Oh no, that was the original question. I saw. Yeah, you can. I mean, a lot of the stuff as I'm working with this is you can deploy the backend site. You can deploy the whole cluster, set it up, and do entirely local development with your Gatsby site and see the functionality that way as well. Any other questions from anybody?
All right, well, we'll go ahead and wrap here. I'm going to share my screen. So I want to point out for everyone that we do have the Expo Hall and networking for Drupal contractors demo that's going to be open from 1:45 to 2. And then from 2 to 2:50, we have our featured session on stage, Accessible Images When It Matters Most by Carrie Fisher. So definitely be a lookout for that.
I believe that we have a booth as well. I think my colleague Ash is in there now, and I'll probably hang out in there for a few minutes if anybody wants to come by with a question they didn't ask here. I'll be there for a bit as well.
Chad, well, greatly appreciate it. If anybody has any further questions, definitely feel free to reach out to Chad. But awesome presentation, Chad. I greatly appreciate your time today, and thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks, everyone. Thanks, Brian.